This video is brought to you by contributions to patreon.com/Henry Kathman from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to the world of Pokémon, an awe-inspiring realm where every nook and cranny is graced with a wealth of mysterious creatures. Some, masters of the heavens above, others, caretakers of the earth below, and some who have had their identities inextricably altered by the maddening abyss that is the internet. Yes, of all the media franchises out there, there are few that have inspired the breadth of fanworks like Pokémon has. Everything from original Pokémon, trainer characters, to entire regions depicted in every type of fanwork that can be found online. While cultural ubiquity and nostalgia are certainly factors to Pokémon's internet presence, it cannot be denied how these games also create a lot of personal investment in its players through its mechanics. Whether someone first encounters the franchise through the mainline RPGs, the spin-offs, the trading card game, the anime, or the millions of licensed products out there, the world of Pokémon presents fans with a litany of choices that personalizes their relationship with the series. Plenty of digital ink has been spilled discussing Pokémon fan content like games, comics, and original characters, but I don't want to talk about that. Instead, this video is going to explore a subset of the Pokémon fan community that is about as niche as it gets. One that takes these lovable creatures into a realm dictated by dice and DMs. So join me, young trainers, as I guide you through the perilous realm of Pokémon tabletop role-playing games. And yes, you did hear me say the word perilous, because in all of my years of being the Forever GM, these games have been some of the most frustrating and rewarding systems that I have ever run. And it's my hope in making this video that you can have some of those same experiences without making some of the mistakes that I've made. But before we can get to any of that, I need to make a couple of caveats. First thing out of the gate, please do not treat this as a standard review for any of the games that I'm going to be talking about. One, because I am no Quentin Smith, hallowed be his name. Two, unlike other RPGs that are published by the likes of Chaosium, Paizo, or Wizards of the Coast, these systems are unofficial products created outside of the watchful gaze of Game Freak, the Pokémon Company, and Nintendo. This might be a positive for some people, but it does mean that we are dealing with games that were the result of fans spending what have often been years of their lives creating these experiences out of the pure love of the hobby. For whatever criticism I'm going to level at any of these systems, I think the work of these fans deserves to be praised for just that fact alone. In a more just society, the people who have brought countless hours of joy to millions of people for these or any other fan games would be able to receive the same recognition and compensation as any official developer. Finally, unlike other forms of entertainment, tabletop games have the benefit of being far more malleable to the preferences of you and your group. Through homebrew and house rules, it is more possible for any GMs out there to iterate and improve on the designs of these games. It's with that in mind that I want to stress that your mileage may vary with any of the suggestions that I'm going to talk about. In my time of GMing various games, my trainers have generally been quite knowledgeable on the base mechanics of Pokémon, which has resulted in a higher tolerance for some of the crunchier elements that can be found in these rules. And believe me, things are going to get pretty crunchy. But even though I'm going to be offering a spirited defense of some of that crunch, I also want to encourage any GMs out there to consider whatever rules you believe are going to produce the most enjoyable experiences for you and your players. All of that said, in order to understand what makes these games work, let's start off with some of the challenges that come out of designing any tabletop system from the world of Pokémon. To do this, let's just consider how weird Pokémon is as a series from a design standpoint, especially when compared to other video games adapted for tabletop. Unlike classic JRPGs like Final Fantasy, Chrono Trigger, or Dragon Quest, players don't control a small party consisting of a dozen bespoke characters, but instead are assembling a team composed of the 1,025 Pokémon that have been created as of this writing. This already gives players over a quadrillion different possible combinations for possible Pokemon teams. And that's even before you factor in individual movesets and stats for each team member, which ostensibly results in a nigh infinite number of paths that trainers can walk on in their Pokemon journeys. All of this is great and is partially why Pokemon retains such a feeling of personalization while remaining comprehensible to players of varying skill levels, but the sheer quantity of variables results in much of the complexity that we'll be discussing. Because unlike the video game, players that want to translate Pokemon into a tabletop setting have to decide between retaining the personalization of the video games or simplifying the experience at the cost of its customizability.
As a key example of this, I want to point to one of the earliest attempts at a Pokemon tabletop system which I personally have the most familiarity with: Pokémon Tabletop Adventures. PTA, as it is known by the community, is a D20 system developed by a user known as Dr. Mr. Stark since 2011, who has been iterating upon and updating the game as recently as July of 2024. Its other major companion in this realm is Pokémon Tabletop United, which was originally built as a spin-off of PTA system that has gone on to become the community's go-to pick as a rule set.
In both PTA and PTU, trainers manage not just one character sheet, but a sheet for their trainer and every single Pokemon that they have on their team. Not only tracking each feature, skill, or ability for their trainers, but every Pokemon stat from the game. These can include a Pokemon's base stats, their stab ratings, their evasion bonuses, to individually raised or lowered combat stages, all which could have been previously calculated by the game software, but now it's being managed by a group of players surrounded by more paperwork than whatever poor accountant was saddled with Team Rocket's monthly expense sheet.
Hold on. I'm sorry, you destroyed how many giant robots to catch a single Pikachu? What do you mean you haven't caught it yet?
And now, a brief interlude showcasing a single turn of combat in Pokémon Tabletop Adventures. Step 1. Announce the move you plan to attack a target Pokémon with. Each move will have an accuracy check, known as an AC, that players must roll above in order to hit. Step 2. The target Pokémon must add the Defense or Special Defense Evasion bonus to the AC. This evasion bonus increases for every 5 points the target Pokémon has invested into the Defense or Special Defense. Step 3. The target Pokémon must now add the Speed Evasion bonus to the new AC. Unlike Defense or Special Defense, the Pokémon's Speed Evasion bonus increases by 1 for every 10 points invested into the Speed. Step 4. The attacking trainer rolls a d20. If the resulting roll is above the new AC with the evasion bonuses, the attack hits. Step 5. Now that the attack is hit, look at the damage value listed on the move and roll the corresponding number of dice listed in the move. Step 6. Add the appropriate bonuses to the damage dice. These include the Pokemon's attack or special attack stat, the same type attack bonus if the Pokemon is the same type as the move used, as well as any bonus damage incurred if any of these stats have had the combat stages raised or lowered. You probably think this would be done now that you've calculated the damage, but we're not done yet, you fool, you plank, you muppet, you addle. Step 7. After calculating your Pokemon's damage amount, give this total damage to the target, where they will subtract either the defense or special defense stat from the total amount of damage given. Make sure they specifically use the actual stat and not the bonus, or they'll get really pissed about weak moves somehow taking down the level 45 Scolipede in 2 hits.
That's a fictional example?
Step 8. So now that you've done all of that addition and subtraction, it's time to bust out more calculations, motherfucker! That's right, we haven't even accounted for type weaknesses and resistances, so Arceus help you have a Pokemon with multiple types, because you might have to multiply or divide that total damage amount by 2 or 4 if the target Pokemon is weak or resistant to a specific type. Step 9. After applying all weaknesses, resistances, and immunities, subtract this final total from the defending Pokemon's current HP. Step 10. Have your trainers remind you that the Goodray you attacked had the Sap Sipper ability, meaning that it doesn't take any damage from grass-type moves. Step 11. Fall into a blind rage as you realize that the calculations you have been running for the past 5 minutes have been a complete waste of time, all while your trainers laugh at you for forgetting this ability for what has been now the 6th time this campaign.
With all of these calculations and equations, the play experience of most Pokémon tabletop RPGs sees battles moving at a glacial pace as players try to calculate the numbers that would appear in mere seconds if this were a video game, making these some of the most crunchiest tabletop systems that I have ever experienced. And keep in mind, this is coming from someone who has played Lancer and understands a whopping 40% of whatever's going on in Shadowrun. And anyone who tells you that they understand everything that's happening in Shadowrun is both a coward and a fool, no matter how many D6s they throw at me.
It's no wonder that when other players look to improve on Dr. Mr. Stark's work, many of them would opt to embed a greater degree of simplicity within these rule systems. For some examples, Pokéroll by Alida Soli and Ruben Sanchez takes Pokemon's complex stats and reduces it to rolling a bunch of D6s. Pokémans by Chronic Delusionalist uses the Savage World system to place a higher emphasis on narrative over raw stats, whereas games like Pokémon 5e and even the most recent editions of PTA see all of the Pokédex shift into a more standard bestiary like those seen in Dungeons & Dragons, where every Pokémon now has the same set of standard attacks and generally uniform stats.
And for many players, if that added level of simplicity is just a thing to get them to enjoy a Pokémon tabletop game, more power to them. But for myself and my players, we haven't felt the need to move to any of these systems. Maybe it's just what we're used to, maybe the crunch has overtaken our mental faculties, or maybe there's something that gets lost when certain things get simplified. As someone who has played through many a fan game that attempts to take this or that media franchise into the world of tabletop, at a certain point, you begin to see the ways that adapting certain things to fit some existing rule sets causes that media to lose some of the things that made you want to adapt it in the first place. Now, in the case of Pokémon, the defining elements that I would want to be able to transfer to any of these rule sets would be the sense of progression and personalization that players get as their teams grow stronger with each battle. Don't get me wrong, from a GM management standpoint, I completely understand why people would want to opt for the approaches of Pokéroll or Pokémon 5e. Though, if I applied a one-size-fits-all approach where every Pokémon operates the same as the rest of its species, I know my players wouldn't have the same level of attachment and ownership of their Pokémon than they would in something seen in PTA or PTU. On an even broader scale, that approach also seems to run in the face of Pokémon's core themes of coexistence with nature, which has been a defining element of the series since day one. The idea that you could create a group of Pokémon that behave with identical traits makes it a lot harder to see them as individual creatures that should be treated as equals and partners, rather than a collection of heartless numbers. And it's within that sense of individualization that I feel that Pokémon Tabletop shines in spite of the frustrations I spent the past 2,000 words banging on about. Even though I've spent a lot of time discussing the amount of crunch that can be found in systems like PTA, those systems act in service of what I consider one of the most important elements to any good RPG: player expression. Pokemon already facilitates a lot of player expression in the ways that trainers build their main Pokemon team. As such, one of the biggest selling points for any of these tabletop systems is the ability for players to be able to move beyond the standard protagonist track of a young trainer taking on the region's Pokemon League. This is something that has already been explored in Pokemon spin-off games such as the Ranger and Mystery Dungeon series, though because the video games operate as a primarily single-player experience, these tabletop systems encourage players to take on a more specialized role within their parties.
Games like Pokéroll seek to do this just by quantifying trainer stats. PTU and Pokemans have their trainers adopt different skills known as edges that give players extra features to use. Though Pokemon Pen and Paper and PTA offer my favorite iteration of this through giving players dedicated trainer classes that give different features and abilities as they level up, in the vein of games like D&D and Pathfinder. While this took an admittedly janky approach in earlier editions of PTA, part of what I enjoy about this progression is how it allows players to prioritize the elements of Pokemon they enjoy the most, as trainers level up by gaining what are known as honors, which signify any milestones such as filling up the Pokedex, winning a gym challenge, or bonding with their Pokemon team.
What I especially enjoy about this is the ways that it naturally guides players towards pursuing their own goals, which results in a far more dynamic story that sees players adopting different play styles to better serve those goals. And players are going to really want to pursue those honors because those higher level trainer abilities can take players into some wonderfully ridiculous places.
To give a perfect example of this, my very first PTA campaign saw one of my players taking the role of Moose McGillicuddy, an old man with memory issues that, through some backstory nonsense, became a Pokemon Mystic, a trainer class that has the ability to channel the abilities and moves of his Pokemon at the cost of his own health. Towards the end of the campaign, the party was investigating a shady game corner in one of the region's biggest cities, when one of the security guards began to confront Moose. In response, Moose proceeded to channel one of his Pokemon's attacks, resulting in the security guard seeing this elderly amnesiac open his mouth and shoot out a hyper beam on the casino floor. And even if the abilities get a little broken as the party level up, this is the kind of tabletop nonsense that I enjoy the most.
But even when trainer classes operate on the tamer side of things, something that also makes this inclusion quite helpful is how it manages to address one of the flaws players might encounter in the video games. See, one of the limitations that Pokemon falls into as a battle system is the ways that each Pokemon is restricted to 4 dedicated moves, causing the players to be saddled with up to 24 moves at most if you have a full team of 6. This limitation helps to simplify the already massive scope of its battle system, but the result is that certain players end up eschewing certain moves that could serve a tactical benefit in favor of raw damage. But because players aren't operating alone in tabletop setting, certain trainer classes like Pokemon Breeders and Coordinators are able to prioritize moves that take on a more supportive role, creating tactics and team compositions that would be considered non-optimal in a single-player experience. While I have my misgivings about some of the changes made to Pokemon in the 3rd edition of PTA, this system is by far my favorite iteration of these trainer classes, primarily because it follows a simple progression system of the trainers choosing to add a single stat point or deciding to adopt the next feature for their trainer classes. Though this becomes interesting once players reach a certain level and must choose to either adopt an advanced class or multi-class into one of the other base trainer classes. The result of all of this customization is that no matter what trainer class your character starts at, by the end of your campaign, each of your players will find themselves acting in ways completely different from their other party members.
Case in point, 2 of my players in my current PTA campaign started out with the researcher-based class. One was Savannah Georgia, a young woman interested in ancient civilization. The other, Rockruff Peterson, a nature video creator who specialized in getting Pokemon to attack him. Savannah eventually taking the archaeologist class, and Rockruff the Rising Star Advanced class from the Coordinator track. Not only did this progression affect the abilities that they gain, it also affected what specific goals these trainers wish to achieve on their journeys, with Savannah wishing to get to the center of the region's ancient civilization while trying to respect its culture and history, while Rockruff navigates the pressures of growing an audience without compromising his conservation work.
That's a kind of story that the Pokemon games don't get to delve into that often, but it's that added layer of narrative complexity that can make campaigns like this a breath of fresh air for those who have played the video games and wish for stories that weren't completely centered on protecting the region's legendary Pokemon from yet another meticulously themed criminal organization. Which leads me into the second major positive of these game systems. Because Pokemon is a game series that has to primarily cater to a younger audience potentially picking up the series for the first time, Game Freak often has to design their stories and gameplay with that newer audience in mind, which can cause most of these games to only ramp up in difficulty once players have beaten the Elite Four. But If you're playing a Pokemon tabletop RPG, there's a good chance that your players are already quite knowledgeable about the various intricacies of the series, which clever DMs can use to their advantage when it comes to designing possible mysteries and challenges for their campaigns.
One example that I'm particularly proud of as a GM is a puzzle that I designed inside one of the many ancient ruins found inside of the game's region. Deep inside this temple, there is a large stone door that cannot be opened by any conventional means. In front of the door, there are 4 large pillars decorated with different carvings of Pokemon, each containing an alcove small enough to place a small object inside, and a set of 4 unknown glyphs at the top of each pillar. Additionally, there was a small mosaic in the center of the pillar that depicts a spiraling pattern with 4 environments on each corner. At the center of that spiral is a 4x4 grid of square tiles divided into 4 sections of 2x2. While the solution of this puzzle could have been solved by the standard means of decoding the cipher listed at the top of the 4 pillars, my players were able to figure out what they needed to do just through their knowledge of Pokemon. Spoilers for anyone wishing to solve this puzzle for themselves, but the trainers realized that the Pokemon on each pillar each evolved through evolutionary stones, meaning that in order to open the door, they needed to locate 4 different evolutionary stones to place inside the alcoves of the pillar. Where other RPG puzzles often rely on the players having to find the hint with a dice roll or by locking story progression behind a riddle, Pokemon RPGs have the ability to act more as test for the trainer's Pokemon knowledge, allowing for players to apply the series' mechanics to areas outside of battle, further illustrating the idea of Pokemon being more than tools for battle.
And speaking of battles, as much as I have complained about the complexity behind the battle systems of certain games, some of the Pokemon battles that I have staged have also been some of the most satisfying tactical challenges offered by an RPG, albeit with some caveats. For one, these had occurred whenever my players were encountering a battle that I, as the GM, was able to anticipate, including battle tournaments, gym challenges, and confrontations with particularly powerful Pokemon. When I was able to utilize the terrain and the hundreds of printed minis that I had made in preparation for these sessions, combat becomes comparable to chess, as each trainer managed the different moves of their different Pokemon teams while also accounting for their positions on the board, the frequency in which they can use their moves, alongside with the other weaknesses and resistance core to the base Pokemon games. Not only does this act as a culmination for all the training the players had done up to that point, it also becomes an opportunity for the trainers to showcase their knowledge in ways that evokes the best and most creative moments of the Pokemon anime and Pokemon adventures. Some of my proudest moments as a GM occurred in the occasional sessions where my trainers were competing against one another in a battle tournament, and the groups had become so knowledgeable and familiar with the mechanics of the game that I was able to take a back seat and acted less as an omniscient god of this world, but more as a fellow trainer that was trying my best to compete with them under these rules. And any system that causes the GMs to act on the same level as their players is a great system in my book. So if you've watched this far into the video, there's a good chance that you are interested in playing your own Pokemon tabletop game and are wondering where you might start. Well, the first thing you would need to consider is what you want to prioritize in your play experience. If you're someone who heard me talk about Pokemon's battle system and started tasting copper, I might point you to one of the rules light systems like Pokemon's or A Monster's Tale by 5 Point Press.
Both of these take the framework of other rules light systems like Powered by the Apocalypse and Savage World in ways that place much less emphasis on the actual leveling and moves that are found in the original games, in favor of emulating the feelings of the Pokemon manga and anime, especially in how both tend to cite the rule of cool above all else. And as an added bonus, both of their guides are filled with many delightful illustrations and pieces of flavor text that make them nice casual reads.
But if your players are much more interested in something that feels mechanically closer to the video games, they might have a better time with something like Pokemon Pen and Paper version, which opts to take the novel approach to a role-playing system where trainer actions and abilities are still determined by traditional dice rolls and stats, though when it comes to emulating the mechanics of Pokemon battles, the system simplifies it by literally emulating them in battle simulator softwares like Pokémon Showdown, offloading all of that potential crunch to a computer. While this might be the ticket for you and your group, completely removing some of the tabletop elements from this system seems like it removes a lot of the fun that could be found in a game like this, no matter how convenient such online tools are. Which is why I'm gonna be a little bit controversial and recommend Pokémon Tabletop United for any new groups wishing to use a more rules-heavy system. Which might seem strange given that I've spent most of this video extolling the virtues of PTA, but from a GMing standpoint, the main thing that puts PTU on top at present is Pokesheets, a free online management tool created by the user Fedorable Will.
This tool allows GMs to generate any number of Pokemon for a battle with their own dedicated stats, making encounter design much easier and manageable. Truthfully, before this website was created, I would have recommended PTA in a heartbeat for quite similar reasons, as the user VaultDweller24 had created a similar generator years ago before Pokesheets came along. When I decided to start GMing a Pokemon tabletop game, it was Vault Dweller's site that had ultimately made me decide to go with PTA. And in that time, it has proven to be an indispensable tool for all the games that I have run over the years, something that I will be eternally grateful for. All of this makes it more painful to see the site become increasingly outdated as Vault Dweller moved on to other projects and left the site without an update since Generation 7, which has made the process of adding new Pokemon to the games a bit more difficult from a preparation standpoint.
To be clear, this is not a condemnation of Vault Dweller or the state of the site, but it does serve as a reminder that fan games live and die by the ability of hobbyists to support these games for potential years after the fact. Even though there are so many things about PTA's trainer classes and progression that I ultimately prefer, it would feel like a disservice to my fellow GMs to recommend a system that has far less community support. But if you're still intrigued by the trainer classes of PTA, you might decide to take the option that my group has taken, where we have adopted the improved trainer rules of PTA's 3rd edition and combined it with the rules of Pokemon in PTU or PTA's 2nd edition, so Pokemon can still maintain their individualized stats and moves. Though whatever rule system you decide to go with, I want to end this video off with some final tips for any GMs that want to start their own Pokemon campaigns. First, keep your areas small.
During the first Pokemon campaign I ran, I opted to use a region based on England using a video created by the YouTuber Mr. Buddy. This saw my trainers journeying from town to town, battling the evil Team Imperium, solving the mysteries of the legendary Pokemon Toxagen, and ultimately defeating the Elite Four.
While we had a great time in this region, one of the biggest issues we found as the campaign continued is a lack of attachment to any of the places or people they had visited and met over the course of their journey. Sure, there were a handful of recurring characters that they had some familiarity with, but the fundamental structure of journeying from town to town resulted in players becoming far less attached to any individual trainer or place in the region. So by the time we closed in on the climactic battle with Team Imperium, many of the story reveals would be punctuated by my trainers repeating a phrase that a GM never wants to hear. Oh, yeah! Who are they again? Because of this, my first major suggestion would be to keep the scope of your setting small to better facilitate that level of familiarity with your players and the world.
You might go about this by asking your players what their favorite places in the Pokemon world are and setting your campaign there. You could decide to center your campaign around a specific goal as to better focus on the kinds of characters your players are interested in.
If you're especially ambitious like me, you might do what I did and design a completely original region that could reflect this more intimate scope.
By the time I got to my second campaign, I decided to design my own region based on the Galapagos Islands. Not only would this region be far smaller than the last region my trainers had explored, it also only had one major human settlement, with the city of Port Lantana. This change was inspired by two seemingly incongruous sources found outside of the Pokemon series. The first came from cozy farming simulators like Stardew Valley and Wildflowers.
Now, some of you might have just entered a fugue state when you heard me say farming simulator, but this inspiration mostly stems from the ways that games like Stardew Valley often have players interacting with the same relatively small cast of townspeople, and pursue stories based on how close they get with those player characters. This is an approach that I think many GMs can benefit from, regardless of which role-playing system you play. Though, this approach becomes especially beneficial for the world of Pokemon because it made it a lot easier for me as a GM to think about which Pokemon would be partnered up with these characters. This helped me avoid a problem that I found in my last campaign where I would be so focused on populating each town and city with a list of characters that the Pokemon began to take less of a focus to the point where they felt more like an accessory to the stories rather than characters unto themselves.
On the less cozy side of things, the second source of inspiration was found in legacy games like Gloomhaven, which often involve players taking on individual missions and goals for each session, with their choices subtly building up the world and presenting different consequences for their actions. Instead of having a region map filled with dedicated routes and paths to take, the Galapagos region was divided into their own bespoke areas that had their own places of interest, obstacles and challenges, and specific Pokemon common to those areas.
And like any good legacy game, whenever my players had discovered an important location, they got to place a little sticker on it, cause everybody likes adding stickers to a map.
As an approach, this had the benefit of making my campaigns feel less like a linear battle to defeat the evil team. Instead, it caused my game to shift more towards my trainers more openly exploring the land in order to discover which Pokemon can be found in the region. And because of this, my next tip might feel like a bit of a departure from the main games.
Don't focus so much on the gyms. If games like Legends Arceus and Scarlet and Violet are any indication, Pokemon tends to benefit whenever trainers are given much more freedom to pursue their individual goals, which has resulted in far less reliance on gym challenges acting as the be-all end-all to a trainer's Pokemon journey. This is especially true in a Pokémon tabletop game due to the cooperative nature of these systems. One of the biggest hurdles GMs tend to encounter when it comes to translating Pokemon into a TTRPG is the ways that most of these stories of gym challenges often translate to a single trainer challenging a gym leader while the rest of the characters are forced to sit on the sidelines and watch. Not only is this boring to other players, it also subtly disincentivizes players from pursuing their goals outside of the Pokemon League.
Certain rule sets like Pokemans try to circumvent this by giving sidelined characters that provide good commentary and advice the ability to subtly influence and assist the battling trainer, and likewise providing them with ample reward.
Such systems are a great addition to these games, though once I started my second campaign, I didn't have much of a need for these systems because I decided to completely forgo Pokemon gyms in the Galapagos region. This might seem like a strange omission, given how the gym challenges are often built up as the most narratively and mechanically complex parts of each given game, but in the moments where I had opted to have my players challenge a gym leader all at once, I was often met with battles that felt indistinct from the other encounters in that campaign. If anything, I often had players get far more invested whenever they were battling a wild Pokemon they really wanted to catch, as the group would try to whittle down the Pokemon's health bit by bit, all the while struggling with their capture rolls, resulting in far more strategic and tense types of combat.
With all of that in mind, my second campaign placed far more focus on battling wild Pokemon. As a region based on a natural conservation site like the Galapagos Isles, I wanted to place a lot more emphasis on maintaining balance within the ecosystem. As such, each area of the region had a Pokemon that was incredibly important to maintaining the environment. Some examples include a Gyarados that keeps its lake from becoming overpopulated with Barboach, a Florges responsible for pollinating an apricorn grove, to a Tangrowth that filters out any contaminants that could feed into the nearby wetlands. While these Pokemon are quite powerful, their importance to their environments make them too valuable to be captured by anyone. Because of this, the primary goal of these trainers is to seek out these powerful Pokemon so that they can be captured and released. These kinds of battles had the same level of preparation and strategy that could go into a traditional gym challenge, but now it's far easier for all players to participate, and it gives you, the GM, the opportunity to have your trainers battle a Pokemon that is powerful enough to serve as a formidable challenge without the risk of trainers capturing a Pokemon that will completely break your game's balance.
But if you still have trainers that are hankering for a more traditional Pokemon battle challenge, I might suggest adding something like a battle tournament to your campaign. One where your trainers have the chance to test their prowess in a challenging battle, but without the story pressure of locking players out of progression if they end up losing.
For example, because there is only one major city in Galapagos, the residents of Port Lantana instead opted to create a battle club. While the club is filled with plenty of strong personalities befit of a gym leader roster, it operates more like an independent wrestling promotion than an official Pokemon league.
Through the club's monthly tournaments, my players had a chance to compete in different brackets relative to their level, with the top 4 trainers in each bracket being able to advance to the next rank. Some might say that such a forgiving system might lower the stakes of a battle, but as a GM that wants my players to ultimately succeed, removing some of the consequences of a gym battle allowed me to compete against my trainers without needing to pull my punches, resulting in far more brutal yet rewarding fights. But in order to prepare your trainers for these fights, they will need to have a roster of Pokemon to battle with. So my next tip will make your trainer search much more bearable. Give your trainers a semi-complete Pokédex. Because so much of Pokemon is centered on exploration and seeking out different Pokemon, one of the biggest issues unprepared GMs can have is having to figure out which of the 1,025 Pokemon your players can encounter. Obviously, a GM should keep in mind what their trainer's favorite Pokemon are in order to give them something that they can be guaranteed to like, but this can be a little difficult if your players don't have any strong preferences. As a result, I have had many sessions that would see me present a wide variety of different Pokemon, only for my players to not feel especially interested in any of them. And because there were so many options to choose from, that can make preparation a bit overwhelming. Now, the easiest way to circumvent this is to simply limit the number of Pokemon that can be found in your campaign setting. But that doesn't solve the problem of players not engaging with any of the options presented to them. To address this, once I had completed a basic roster of the Pokemon that could be found in my region, one of the things that I gave out to a handful of my players was a semi-complete Pokédex that contained around 10 to 20 catalog Pokemon that could be found in the different environments of the region. This would make it a lot easier for my players to know what to expect when traveling through the different areas, but it also incentivized them into visiting certain places so that they would have a chance of finding their favorite Pokemon that they would want to add to their team. But on top of these player-driven quests, this also added an extra level of convenience for me as a GM. One, it makes it a lot easier to prepare the different Pokemon you will want to use if you are utilizing miniatures or tokens. Two, it significantly lowers the amount of prep work you might have to do by assigning each Pokemon to a random dice table for each environment. 3. The fact that this is an incomplete Pokédex makes it a lot easier for GMs to include any Pokemon that players might be disappointed to see missing, as well as your own diabolical picks.
One thing that I've shied away from in this video is the common practice of GMs including their own original Pokemon and regional variants into their campaigns. As much as I understand this temptation, this is something that feels best when done sparingly. This partially stems from personal preference, since I often find that most Fakemon tend to either fall into the category of overly designed to the point of seeming out of place, and rat-a-tat but with a gun. Because of that, I often find fan-made regional variants a lot more interesting, since they are able to take the foundations of the original designs, but adapted to fit different environments. Obviously, your mileage may vary on this, but I would like to warn any GMs out there that the process of adding Fakemon to the system is often an extra level of work and complexity that you should be aware of up front. If your players are interested in seeing original Pokemon, regional variants are far easier to design around since they tend to have similar stats, but different typing and moves.
Regardless of what kind of Pokemon you decide to add, as an added bonus, you'll want to save that reveal for when your trainers feel pretty comfortable with your world. Because the moment you get to show off a previously uncatalogued Pokemon in the wild, you will get to revel in your players sheepishly flipping through their Pokedexes and fervently trying to capture a Pokemon they might have otherwise overlooked. Because of all of the things that make Pokemon great, one of the things that often feels increasingly absent is that sense of mystery that comes with the Pokemon world. As each part of the series becomes increasingly dissected and commodified by fans and Nintendo alike, it can make it a lot easier for people to lose sight of the messages of this series. Being able to coexist with our world, the creatures in it, and our fellow trainers. Finding strength not just through sheer force and power, but also knowledge, curiosity, and understanding. But as this video has demonstrated, it seems like there will always be new designers and GMs out there that will try to capture the world of Pokemon in their games. So I hope that any of those new designers are able to keep some of this advice in mind. Because part of my favorite thing about both Pokemon and TTRPGs is a sense of community and curiosity that they bring to people. And in those moments where Pokemon and tabletop meet, it served as a reminder of how wonderful our own world is, no matter how many D6s a game might use. Thank you for watching. Best wishes.
I've been talking shit about Shadowrun! What the fuck?
Hey everybody, special thanks to all of the amazing fan artists that I have featured all throughout this video. Please let me know if I have accidentally misattributed any of the artists that have been featured in here. I really want to make sure that they're given the proper credit. And also, hey, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end of the video to watch it. If you enjoy what I do, there's the obligatory like, comment, and subscribe, but if you support me for $1 on Patreon, you can already get access to my next video series. The first episode is already out of that. So I hope wherever you are, you're doing all right, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.